the obvious question I have to ask, it seems an awful long journey from Xenopus Leavis to the stars.
Yes.
How did you come to find yourself in the world's leading space center?
Do you want to know the real story, or?
Of course we want the real story.
Oh, okay. So the real story is I applied for hundreds of jobs. When I knew I had to leave EMBL, Kai had originally offered me a position at the Max Planck, and then that didn't happen. In the end, I ended up kind of doing my own tour. I went around and I funded my own tour to go and give seminars about my work and try to line up some other types of positions. And in the end, I was in California and sitting in a friend's office in San Francisco crying because, like, what am I going to do? And my friend, she didn't even know I was there. She just came into her office and saw me there crying. And then we talked and she said, oh, I heard about this position. She said, I applied for this position at NASA, and mentioned a woman that I knew from both undergrad and graduate school who was working here. And she said, that position is open. You should call Ruth Globus and talk about it. So I called Ruth Globus and talked about the position and spent that next weekend just the whole weekend writing and learning about NASA and space and frogs in space. So they had recently, before I had applied, they had actually just sent up a very interesting experiment about the primary vertebrate axis in space. So it was to test the hypothesis that gravity is actually required for that vertebrate axis. And the way that you can do that is if you send frogs in space, there's no gravity. And so what happens? Does that axis develop normally? And it does. But they had just done this great experiment where they sent female frogs up to space, and then they sent the testes so that they could actually fertilize the eggs in space. So they had the frogs lay the eggs in space, fertilize them, and and then brought the embryos back and looked at developmental studies. And actually, when years later, when I went to visit at UC Berkeley, they still had space frogs at UC Berkeley. So they collaborated with UC Berkeley on that experiment, and it was very, very successful. So that was my in, that there was the biology department here didn't have a frog biologist, and they thought, oh yeah, the other thing was that they had a mandate from, I'm not sure who, that they needed to hire some cytoskeletal people. So I fit they hired at the same time a zebrafish biologist, a frog biologist, and then an actin cytoskeleton person.
So space everywhere outside of the lower Earth atmosphere seems to be an incredibly hostile environment for life as we know it on Earth.
Yes.
So what has NASA learned about that?
One of the biggest risks of going to Mars is that long duration space flight, and in particular, both for equipment and for humans, the radiation out there is pretty devastating, because you have these heavy particles that are going at the speed of light, coming in random directions from the origin of the universe, and they wreak havoc on cells, they wreak havoc on DNA, and they wreak havoc on equipment as well. So you have to have, for any equipment that you send out there, you have to have it hardened, what they call radiation hardened, which means you have to have lots of duplicative efforts for any circuits, et cetera. Shielding is a big problem, because the best shield is water, but water is heavy. So it's how do you actually shield astronauts who are going out for long distance, for long duration spaceflight? That's actually a big problem. The other big problem is weightlessness. So if you're going on a 3-year mission to Mars, your body suffers a big toll. You lose a lot of muscle mass and bone mass, and you have the spaceship environment where you have to have life support systems that are amenable to humans, and any kind of countermeasures that can help you stave off those losses. And so that's actually quite problematic to be able to to be able to get to Mars and then be able to do anything, to get even, you've seen astronauts coming back to Earth after a couple of months or a whole year, and they can't move. And then when they get back, their body breaks out in rashes, and their whole immune system goes kind of crazy. And so it's an adjustment to, readapting to gravity is not trivial. The other thing that, people don't realize very much, or maybe they're starting to realize, is that you have this, that gravity plays a huge part in just the blood flow within our system. Your heart is always pumping blood up to your brain, right? And that doesn't stop when you're in microgravity, but gravity is pulling blood down to your feet. And so you have this excess of blood going to your brain, and fluid, general fluid going to your brain in space. And that actually, people's heads get bigger. They have problems with, in particular in men, they have problems with their eyes. And so it's, there's definitely just a lot of metabolic shifts. There's, one of the big problems that we've determined through just analysis of gene expression studies is actually the role of mitochondria and mitochondrial dysfunction in space. And a lot of that has to do with oxidative damage. And then we don't know what some of the other mechanisms are. And I'm not an expert on that, but it's something that I find, that is actually really important to understand, is how we could use, changes in mitochondria how we could develop countermeasures that would help that would help systematically cells in the body.
How do you do a good job of explaining to society, to the taxpayers, that they're getting value for money, and inspiring the next generation of young people who, you may want to come and follow careers in science? That's something you obviously have done very successfully at NASA, which has carried on for so long. Could you share some thoughts on how NASA goes about accounting to the American taxpayer what it's delivering and inspiring the young people about the future?
The education programs that I've been involved with, I've been very happy to be part of those programs, and I've also had to kind of argue for continuing those programs when those programs were, on the chopping block. So getting advocates for those programs is really important. Keeping in touch with alumni who talk about the value of exactly what you're doing here. What is the value of, the training that I got at EMBL? I can't even calculate the value of it. It was an invaluable experience in my life. It was absolutely critical to my whole scientific development, and I'm eternally grateful for that. Outreach events are amazing. Public outreach events are, that's, and I know that EMBL has started doing that, a lot more of that, and actually have some mobile units that go out and do that. And I think that's also just fantastic. So yeah, I totally, I sign up for every public event where they request volunteers. I develop, all sorts of materials for those. I have a whole thing on model organisms in space, and I'm passionate about those, and those are definitely things that kids like. They like to see tardigrades under the microscope. They like to see, they like to see Drosophila with curly wings and red eyes, and find out that, well, yeah, why do you send flies to space, or why do you send, what's the advantage of doing that?